All of this talk about culture driving me mad. I'm taking it hard. All of the talk about culture driving me mad. I'm taking it hard. How them expect to have culture plan for Caribbean man from North American? We got to start here at home. Then we'll no longer roam.
Culture, God, and crop over. This is a time of the year, and for many Barbadians, the most wonderful time of the year, the crop over season. It is a time that we unleash our creative imagination and celebrate who we are, children of God, rooted in a culture that has its genesis in African culture and enslavement of black bodies. While the Anglican Church has been implicated in this enterprise, it must now be ready, perhaps with some of its other denominations, to re-examine how the Bible and God remain faithful to us for the past 300 years. Crop over is a very ancient celebration. Many communities in the Asian world held celebrations, among them the people of the Old Testament. They celebrated what we can truly call a crop over festival. The Feast of Ingathering or Booths had many elements which were borrowed from a nation far older than Israel, and it was an occasion for dancing and rejoicing. It was time when wine flowed in abundance. It sounds very familiar. The writers of the Old Testament are not ashamed to admit that sometimes people could go overboard. As one Old Testament scholar puts it, the Gathering Festival could be a time of carnival-like overindulgence. But in spite of this negative element, it remained a feast of the Lord.
Days of slavery, when you took me from my daddy, snatched me from my mommy, crossed the Atlantic Sea. So whenever I hear the drums, that's so embedded in me, I just have to walk up my ways because Africa in me. Africa, Africa. When the drum is the beat and the rhythm and the bass, I just have to walk up my ways. Africa, Africa. When the drum is the beat and the rhythm and the bass, I just have to...
Community life. There were celebrations, not excuses to reject the things and the qualities we rarely associate with God, but rather times to connect God to the diverse strands of the community's experiences. There were times to ensure that the events of community life in all their diversity can be readily associated with God. There were times when the community was reminded that festivity and celebration are important elements to our relationship with God. Here is an understanding of festivity and celebration that we can apply to our own crop over festival. It is an understanding that reminds us that we are not, on the basis of what are negative elements, to rule out completely God's interest in this response to the reaping of our most important crop. It is an understanding that reminds us that yes, there will be negative elements in every human endeavor, but we have to work to remove these and to ensure as Christians we do not contribute to the negatives. We are to affirm God's presence, and we are to do so by cultivating and sharing wholesome, positive qualities. We are to affirm God in spite of the negatives. We do so understanding the response of the people of the Bible as our guide. One of the most remarkable things about these people who gave us the wonderful collection of writings we call the Bible was their ability to hold together the diverse and conflicting strands of life. Hold together those experiences that seem alien to God, and yet find God at work within and in spite of this diversity and conflict. Indeed, in spite of all the contradictions. These great persons of faith and the one we confess as Lord and Savior, Jesus of Nazareth, they all held on passionately to the belief that there is no human experience in this world that is not of interest to God. They strongly believed that in spite of the negatives, there will always be something that we can readily associate with God.
When I wake up in the morning and I see the sun, I send up praises, yeah. I know it's a privilege, yeah, to be alive. Oh yeah, from the rising to the setting. When the day is done, I send up praises, yeah. I know it's a privilege, yeah, to be alive. Oh yeah.
Understanding. They preached and lived out the conviction that we can never exclude God from any strand, any experience of life, just because we or others may be inclined to think that these experiences associated with these events are incompatible with our understanding of God. This is whether it is the understanding created or inherited by us. So they strongly believed that God was there at times of revelry, when there was a strong temptation to go overboard and do some things that were the very opposite of what we believe God would want us to do. God was always there at times of sorrow when our world seemed to be falling apart. No one in the Bible held this conviction about the link between God and God's world with all its conflicting and diverse experiences as strongly as Jesus. We find Jesus in his ministry following this great tradition of his ancestors and reminding the publicans, sinners, Gentiles, the women and the children that their experiences, their concerns were also of great interest to God.
What I want to know, why some Trinidadian hate still burn and calypso? What I want to know, why some Trinidadian hate still burn and calypso? Some of them may have no reason. Oh, me lad, oh, hate with music like poison, and where you think does make me ball. Some again don't like calypsos at all. You think them could go in the States and say we have oil? They mad, oh, me lad. Texas have oil more than Trinidad. Oh, lad, so why neglect your culture? You making me feel sad, oh, me lad. Calypso and still bad is the culture of Trinidad.
Complexities. He, like his Old Testament ancestors, believed that God can understand the many complexities and contradictions of human experience, and found in these very complexities and contradictions things that are still acceptable to God. God can step in and provide for us experiences that remind us of God's presence. God can do this whether it is the most dehumanizing experience of slavery or crucifixion, whether it is an agricultural festival of joy and celebration, or one that responds to loss and sorrow. For their God, our God, is not threatened by complexities or diminished by these contradictions. God feels quite at home with festive celebrations, as God is at home in times of loss and sorrow. It is this conviction that led the people of the Old Testament to fit all their experiences, pleasant and unpleasant, into their belief about God. They passionately believed that God cannot be excluded from any experience of God.
I don't mind we practice the cultures. limbo dance. Tata drumming is ours also. Yeah. Let's give them their growing chance. We must show all love for the things we own, for their future is our concern. So let me love, we call it so, and give praise to the limbo, and believe in this divine for the next generation. Let me love our castle, our own. We must nurture when we look to the future with never on the road.
Old Testament. In the book of Deuteronomy, we read of a great effort by the people of the Old Testament to connect God to the reaping of crops. It tells of a crop over celebration. This is because the Feast of Booths, or a gathering, represented a great rejoicing for the wine and the wheat that were treated as precious gifts of God. God, therefore, was intricately connected to life, to living, to joy and celebration, and all the varied experiences that life can produce. But there were and always will be people in the religions of the world who feel a bit uncomfortable in associating God with certain experiences of life. We must respect their position. They were, however, strongly resisted in the Old Testament and the New Testament. When there was an attempt to shield and protect God and keep him only on the side of joy and celebration, and exclude him from the pain and the sorrow and the contradictions of life, as the book of Proverbs and some of the Psalms attempt to do, up came those brilliant theologians who gave us the books of Ecclesiastes and Job. They insisted that we cannot decide this side of heaven where God ought to be, or to whom or to what God should relate. They argue convincingly that we have no authority to protect God from the contradictions of joy, of life. And so God was reinstated in the midst of the painful contradictions of life. God was in the minds of his people, reconnected to this world, God's world, with all its varied experiences. Here God would remain and eventually be related in a new and dramatic way to the most painful of all human experiences and contradictions, death. No experience can be excluded from our relationship to God, not the times of celebration, not even death.
Trials arise and there's no ending in sight, or in the midst of the storm, no shelter to keep warm. I call on you and you are there for me to cast all my fears and burdens away on you, Savior and friend. And I feel God, when my back's against the wall, there's no other name to call. I feel